The media circus began not with a bang, but with a leak. An anonymous insider tip that Mark Wahlberg, beloved Hollywood actor turned entrepreneur, was at the center of a federal securities fraud investigation. Within hours, #Wahlberg scandal was trending globally. News anchors scrambled to cover the breaking story, dragging up old business dealings, fitness ventures, and even revisiting his tumultuous youth. In the public eye, Wahlberg was an underdog who rose from Boston streets to blockbuster stardom. But now, that narrative threatened to unravel in real time. First, the charges seemed implausible. Wahlberg? A white-collar criminal? But the documents released by the Department of Justice painted a different picture. They claimed his wellness empire, IronCore Dynamics, had inflated earnings reports, misled investors, and engaged in shady stock manipulation prior to a multi-million-dollar IPO exit. According to prosecutors, Wahlberg hadn't just been a figurehead, he'd been the architect. The backlash was swift and polarizing. Talk shows split between condemning him and defending him. Celebrities remained silent. Even some of his longtime business partners quietly distanced themselves. When the official indictment came down, the world watched with morbid curiosity. Wahlberg surrendered voluntarily, walking calmly into a federal building in downtown Los Angeles as helicopters buzzed overhead. The judge assigned to the case, Harold D. Morgan, was no stranger to high-profile litigation. A former Marine with a sharp tongue and an even sharper gavel, he had presided over major corruption cases and wasn't known for his patience, especially not with the rich and famous. He had once thrown a Silicon Valley billionaire in contempt for trying to FaceTime into a hearing. His disdain for celebrity defendants wasn't just personal, it was ideological. To him, the courtroom was sacred, not a stage. As Wahlberg entered the packed courtroom for his arraignment, Judge Morgan didn't bother to hide his scowl. Wahlberg, dressed in a charcoal suit and no tie, stood silently, flanked by his attorneys. The air was thick with tension. Spectators, including journalists and legal analysts, filled the pews. Even the jury box, currently empty, seemed to radiate anticipation. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Valerie Drake, wasted no time outlining the severity of the charges. In a calm but cutting voice, she explained how Wahlberg allegedly misled shareholders, manipulated performance metrics, and coordinated insider trading through shell companies. As she spoke, the judge glanced occasionally at Wahlberg, each look loaded with skepticism. When it was time for the defense to speak, Wahlberg's lead attorney, a seasoned but visibly rattled man named Jeff Crane, requested bail and a continuation. Before he could finish, Judge Morgan interrupted with a sarcastic quip. "Let me guess, your client thought the SEC was a movie studio?" The room broke into restrained laughter. Wahlberg didn't flinch. The judge continued, "I hope Mr. Wahlberg understands that this is not a film set. There will be no retakes, no applause, and certainly no dramatic speeches." The actor met the judge's eyes for a moment but said nothing. Crane tried to smooth things over, reminding the court of Mark's clean record, his philanthropic contributions, and his cooperative behavior. The judge replied coldly, "Your client is accused of stealing millions through deception. I don't care if he built orphanages out of protein bars." Bail was granted, but with restrictions. Wahlberg's passport was confiscated, and he was placed under house arrest pending trial. A GPS ankle monitor was fitted, and he was ordered not to speak to the press. The media had a field day, calling it the Wahlberg Walk of Shame. Paparazzi swarmed outside his gated Beverly Hills home, drones flying overhead like vultures circling a carcass. He stayed inside, mostly silent, issuing only a brief statement through his attorney. Mr. Wahlberg maintains his innocence and looks forward to presenting the truth in court. That truth, however, would have to wait. The prosecution announced their intent to bring in a team of forensic accountants and former employees willing to testify. Rumors circulated that Wahlberg's CFO had flipped. The celebrity gossip blogs treated it like a season finale, complete with cast breakdowns and betting pools on his guilt. Behind closed doors, Wahlberg met with his legal team daily. He was quiet, measured, listening more than speaking. His team was perplexed by his composure. Some mistook it for detachment, others for denial. But inside his private study, Wahlberg had begun his own parallel mission. A room once filled with fitness gear and film memorabilia was transformed into a miniature war room. Whiteboards, legal textbooks, corporate bylaws, and trial transcripts from historical white-collar cases filled every inch. Unknown to most, Wahlberg had developed a fascination with law years ago, secretly studying landmark cases and even taking private instruction from a retired judge he'd befriended on a film set. For him, law was never just abstract theory. It was structure, control, and a way to understand the chaos of the world he had climbed through. Now, for the first time, that private passion had real-world stakes. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his legacy. Meanwhile, Judge Morgan remained skeptical. In pretrial hearings, he often used Mark's name as a punchline. Mr. Wahlberg may be used to playing the hero, but in here we deal in facts, not fantasy. His remarks were quoted in headlines the next day. Even other defendants awaiting trial began joking that they hoped they weren't getting the Wahlberg treatment. But Mark endured it all silently, never breaking composure. His lawyers urged him to keep quiet, to let the system work for him. But Wahlberg was already considering something unthinkable, representing himself. He kept the idea quiet for now, knowing that even suggesting it would make his team implode. But in the quiet hours of the night, he studied precedent, memorized the federal rules of evidence, and made annotations in his case files. He wasn't doing it out of arrogance. He was doing it because no one believed he could. As the trial date loomed, media attention intensified. A network announced a docuseries in development. Online forums speculated on courtroom drama. Bets were made on verdict timelines. But Wahlberg remained cloaked in silence. From the outside, it seemed like the calm before a storm. In truth, the storm had already begun. Quiet, internal, methodical. Judge Morgan had already judged him. The public had too. But Mark Wahlberg, the man behind the persona, was preparing for a fight unlike anything he had faced. And this time, there would be no director calling cut, no stunt double to take the fall, and no audience applause to guide his way. Just the cold reality of a courtroom where one wrong move could destroy everything. He had been underestimated before. That, he thought, was his greatest advantage. The courtroom was already packed by the time Mark Wahlberg entered, and not because of the legal merits of the case, but because the man at the defense table was more accustomed to red carpets than federal hearings. Judge Harold Morgan sat atop his bench like a statue carved from disdain, his gavel resting nearby like a weapon ready to strike the moment celebrity arrogance dared raise its head. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the first official day of the trial began. Not with a legal argument, but with a theatrical dissection of Mark's perceived incompetence. The judge wasted no time setting the tone, looking directly at Wahlberg and quipping, "Mr. Wahlberg, do you need a script to understand the charges, or can you manage to follow along?" Laughter rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled faster, and cameras outside the courthouse caught the audible snickers that followed. Mark remained still, his expression neutral, his lips pressed into a flat line that neither confirmed offense nor indifference. The judge smirked, already painting the trial as a farce. It wasn't the first jab of the day. When Wahlberg's attorney rose to make a preliminary objection about the way evidence was being introduced, Judge Morgan raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Did he learn that in a Hollywood legal drama?" The courtroom again erupted in muffled laughter, and the prosecution smirked behind their files. The irony was that Mark hadn't even spoken yet, and already he was being ridiculed like a contestant on a courtroom game show. The judge seemed to relish every moment, turning the trial into a public roast session thinly disguised as legal process. He interrupted the defense routinely, dismissed objections before they were finished, and often looked out toward the gallery when making his sardonic remarks, as if performing for an invisible audience. When a paralegal accidentally dropped a folder of documents and Mark bent down to help gather them, the judge muttered, "Oh look, method acting." That time, even some of the journalists looked uncomfortable. Wahlberg's attorneys were growing visibly tense, whispering with one another between each break, clearly unsure how to balance defending their client and not angering the man who held his fate in his hands. At lunch recess, commentators flooded the news cycle with hot takes, speculating not just on the evidence but on the judge's disdain, with some anchors calling it deeply unprofessional, while others labeled it the tough love a Hollywood star needs. The second day was even worse. Judge Morgan addressed Wahlberg directly before proceedings started and asked if he brought his SAG card or was just winging it today. Mark didn't respond, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly, the only visible sign that the mockery had found its mark. Witnesses were called, mostly former executives who had resigned under murky circumstances. While the prosecution worked methodically, the judge maintained his active indifference whenever the defense spoke, occasionally sighing loudly or glancing at the clock as if enduring an unbearable film. When Wahlberg was asked to confirm a document with his signature, the judge interjected, "Is this where we cue the dramatic music?" More laughter. Another dagger to Mark's credibility, not through evidence but through derision. It became clear that the trial was being framed not as a legal proceeding but as a kind of morality play where Wahlberg was not only the accused, but the punchline. Yet through it all, Mark never cracked. He sat through hours of direct and cross-examinations, legal back-and-forths, and evidentiary procedures without raising his voice or showing the indignation that many expected. The judge mistook this silence for docility, or perhaps ignorance. To the world outside, it looked like the actor was being outplayed in a game he didn't fully understand. There were whispers that he was losing faith in his team, that he might accept a plea, that maybe he was the clueless figure the judge painted him to be. But those who watched closely saw something else. A flicker behind his eyes during each exchange, a subtle movement of his pen across a legal pad, a nod to himself after a line of questioning concluded. Mark was studying not the case but the people in the room, the prosecutor, the judge, the rhythm of their communication. He was building a profile not for a role but for survival. On the third day, Judge Morgan escalated the humiliation by openly mocking Wahlberg's acting career during a sidebar conference, knowing the court reporter would transcribe it. "This guy once played a talking teddy bear's best friend. And now he thinks he understands securities law." Mark didn't flinch, but the moment was picked up by court sketch artists and went viral as a meme within hours. It didn't help that one of the prosecutor's exhibits was a magazine interview where Wahlberg had jokingly called himself a businessman with abs. The judge referred to it repeatedly, scoffing, "Businessman with abs is not a legal qualification, last I checked." At one point, when a witness was asked about the company's financial discrepancies, the judge waved his hand and said, "Let's simplify things for our movie star. Think of it like box office returns, only these were fake." The courtroom laughed again. By now, the audience had been conditioned to expect this showmanship from the bench. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. It was a spectacle one Mark had no control over. Yet, what no one realized was that the jokes were fueling something in him. Not rage, not vengeance, but calculation. Every insult, every sideways remark, every unjust dismissal of his voice was becoming a quiet ledger in his mind. Mark wasn't just being mocked, he was being handed a narrative. And he understood the power of narrative better than anyone in the room. While Judge Morgan saw him as a fallen celebrity stumbling through legal complexity, Mark saw himself as something else entirely. The underdog protagonist no one believed in. And in his world, that was the best role of all. After all, heroes rise not when they are adored, but when they are dismissed. So he took the ridicule, stored it, built upon it, and waited for his cue. Not the kind that comes from a director, but the moment when everything shifts. At the end of the week, as the court adjourned, Judge Morgan leaned back and said, "Let's hope Mr. Wahlberg has learned something useful by now. If not, there's always community theater." Another chuckle, another jab. But this time, Mark allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Not out of amusement, but out of anticipation. Because what no one yet suspected, least of all Judge Morgan, was that the man being mocked into silence was about to speak. And when he did, everything would change. On the morning of the trial's second full week, a ripple of confusion moved through the courtroom like a current under still water when Mark Wahlberg approached the bench and calmly requested permission to speak directly to the court. Judge Morgan raised a skeptical brow, assuming it was some plea for leniency or a desperate emotional monologue designed to curry sympathy. But what came out of Wahlberg's mouth stunned everyone. With no flair, No dramatic gestures. He stated, "Your Honor, I would like to formally request to dismiss my legal representation and proceed as my own counsel." A gasp rose from the gallery, and even the prosecution turned their heads with visible disbelief. His lawyers protested immediately, arguing that such a move would be not only foolish but reckless. Yet Wahlberg stood his ground with an eerie calm. Judge Morgan, clearly caught off guard, leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Wahlberg, do you have any legal training whatsoever? Or are you simply doubling down on your delusions of grandeur?" The actor replied, "I've studied law privately for over a decade, Your Honor. Constitutional law, corporate litigation, federal securities statutes. I've passed multiple simulated bar exams and worked with a retired appellate judge in private mentorship." Morgan scoffed, but his curiosity was visibly piqued. The courtroom, always hungry for spectacle, had just been served an entree of shock. The judge, reluctantly but legally bound to honor the request under the Sixth Amendment, asked a series of probing questions meant to expose Wahlberg's ignorance, but the actor answered each one precisely, citing case law with accuracy and using terminology that made even the clerks glance up in surprise. When asked about the standard of review for motions to suppress evidence, Wahlberg responded with the correct three-tier test and cited United States versus Leon to clarify good faith exceptions. By the end of the impromptu grilling, Judge Morgan had lost his smirk. Wahlberg was granted the right to proceed pro se, and in that moment, the courtroom transformed from a stage of ridicule into an arena of revelation. The next day, he returned not as a defendant drowning beneath mockery, but as a man armed with legal authority, carrying a thick binder and a laptop, dressed in the same modest suit, his demeanor unshaken. He made no attempt to dazzle or charm. He didn't try to act like a lawyer. He simply was one. And when he stood to cross-examine the first hostile witness, even the prosecution held their breath. The witness, a former IronCore Dynamics accountant, had previously testified about anomalies in financial filings that allegedly pointed to fraudulent activity. Wahlberg began his questioning slowly, establishing routine facts, but then made a sudden pivot, producing a financial reconciliation report the witness had authored 6 months prior to the alleged fraud. He asked why that document wasn't included in the evidence presented. The witness stuttered, visibly unsettled, and muttered something about oversight. Wahlberg didn't relent. He pointed to metadata that showed the document had been modified after the witness's resignation and introduced evidence from a digital forensics firm that proved the timestamps had been altered. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The judge, though still composed, leaned forward with interest. Wahlberg walked through the reconstruction of the chain of custody like a seasoned litigator, undermining the prosecution's timeline in real time. Then came his first procedural bombshell. A motion to exclude several key exhibits on the grounds that they were derived from documents tainted by digital manipulation. He cited Fry versus United States and Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals to challenge the validity of the methods used to authenticate the evidence. The judge had no choice but to call a recess to review the motion, and when court resumed 2 hours later, the prosecution looked visibly shaken. Judge Morgan, clearly perturbed but unable to argue with the logic, granted the motion partially, excluding several damning pieces of evidence. It was the first major blow to the government's case, and it came from the man they had all mocked. The press outside exploded with headlines. Wahlberg goes full Matlock, from movie star to legal star. Prosecution on the defensive. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The gallery was quieter now, more attentive. The laughter had stopped. Over the next few days, Wahlberg unraveled the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. He demonstrated how internal emails had been selectively quoted to imply criminal intent, when the full threads revealed routine business discussions. He pointed out inconsistencies in the testimonies of former employees, often producing internal memos, board meeting minutes, and audit reports they had conveniently forgotten. During one session, he interrogated a so-called expert witness who had evaluated IronCore's valuation. Using financial models, he exposed that the expert had made erroneous assumptions about market trajectory and customer acquisition costs, errors that, when corrected, altered the entire valuation model and made the supposed fraud mathematically improbable. At one point, Wahlberg even caught the prosecutor misstating a section of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and corrected her on the record, offering both the statutory language and a precedent from the Ninth Circuit to support his interpretation. The courtroom didn't laugh anymore. It held its breath. Judge Morgan, who had once ridiculed him at every opportunity, now found himself reluctantly acknowledging Wahlberg's legal acumen. He stopped interrupting him mid-argument. He began to allow longer stretches of uninterrupted speaking. He even referred to him as Mr. Wahlberg instead of our Hollywood counselor. The media narrative shifted dramatically. Overnight, Wahlberg was no longer the bumbling actor in over his head. He was being called a savant, an autodidact of the courtroom, the legal world's surprise phenom. Some legal scholars appeared on news segments, admitting that his courtroom conduct and argumentation were more polished than many licensed attorneys. Behind the scenes, law firms were reportedly offering him internships, shadow positions, and honorary advisory roles. But Mark ignored it all. He was not there to impress. He was there to win. The final act of that week's proceedings was perhaps the most shocking. Wahlberg requested the court's permission to submit an alternate theory of motive behind the accusations, one that involved a disgraced former board member with a vendetta against him. With surgical precision, he introduced a series of communications that showed how this former associate had orchestrated a whisper campaign, selectively leaked documents to the press, and manipulated departing staff to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity deals. He offered a timeline supported by affidavits, financial tracking, and anonymous insider tips that had been verified. Judge Morgan, initially hesitant, allowed the material to be reviewed under seal. The prosecution, blindsided, requested a delay to re-interview witnesses. For the first time in the trial, they were on the defensive. As court adjourned that day, Wahlberg packed his files slowly, methodically, while reporters outside screamed his name and shoved microphones toward the courthouse steps. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence he had maintained so carefully was now the loudest voice in the room. Inside, Judge Morgan sat still for a moment before rising, giving Wahlberg a long, unreadable look. The man who once mocked him had just witnessed something rare. Not just a surprise, not just a shift, but a recalibration of expectation itself. Wahlberg wasn't playing lawyer. He wasn't pretending. He was one. And the court, the country, and even his enemies were beginning to understand that the trial wasn't about his fame anymore. It was about his mind. By the time the trial entered its third week, the courtroom felt more like a crucible than a legal forum, each day forging a new twist, a new revelation, and at the center of it all stood Mark Wahlberg, a man who had turned ridicule into respect and now set his sights on absolute vindication. The prosecution, once confident and composed, had been reduced to a reactionary force, spending more time responding to Wahlberg's motions than advancing their narrative. It was no longer a matter of whether he could defend himself, it was whether anyone could stop him. His cross-examinations had become legendary, unfolding like cinematic suspense scenes where each question peeled back layers of deception. He no longer spoke with hesitation or the caution of someone walking on unfamiliar ground. He commanded the space now, calmly pacing in front of the jury box as he reconstructed the narrative thread by thread, weaving a counterstory that suggested a meticulously orchestrated campaign to destroy him, not by regulators, but by a man he had once trusted. The name of that man was Julian Kerr, the former CFO of IronCore Dynamics, a brilliant but volatile executive who had quietly exited the company just weeks before the IPO and who, until now, had remained outside the prosecution's spotlight. In an unexpected maneuver that caught even the judge off guard, Wahlberg subpoenaed Kerr to testify, forcing the prosecution to scramble as the defense effectively placed the architect of the case's financial testimony under direct fire. When Kerr entered the courtroom, dressed in a navy blue suit and an arrogant smirk, Wahlberg's posture remained perfectly still, his face unreadable, but his eyes locked onto the man with the intensity of someone staring down a long-awaited opponent. The examination began with pleasantries, but Wahlberg quickly transitioned into hostile territory, pulling out copies of emails Kerr had sent under pseudonymous accounts to financial bloggers who had published hit pieces on IronCore's finances months before the indictment. Kerr tried to deny authorship, but Wahlberg revealed metadata tracing the IP addresses to a coffee shop 2 blocks from Kerr's apartment and a VPN account paid with a credit card registered to his name. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Then Wahlberg brought out whistleblower testimonies, previously unsubmitted to the court, that described how Kerr had pressured junior staff to exaggerate valuation projections and had even boasted privately that if the company ever went under, Mark will take the fall, he's the face, not the brain. The climax of the testimony came when Wahlberg introduced a document that Kerr claimed never to have seen. A private memo to the board, drafted by Wahlberg himself, raising concerns about aggressive projections and recommending they delay the IPO by 6 months to allow for more sustainable growth. The memo was time-stamped, digitally authenticated, and signed by all board members, including Kerr. Kerr, now visibly rattled, claimed he didn't recall signing it. Wahlberg calmly responded, "That's all right. The court will." The judge admitted the memo into evidence, and with it came a monumental shift in the energy of the room. Wahlberg had now not only created doubt but introduced a credible motive for sabotage and shown a history of internal integrity, contrary to the prosecution's portrayal of reckless greed. Over the next several days, Wahlberg continued to exploit weaknesses in the government's case, arguing that they had built their foundation on cherry-picked data provided by a disgruntled insider with personal vendettas and financial interests in Mark's downfall. Using public trading records, he showed that Kerr had bought large short positions in IronCore stock through a series of shell accounts, benefiting immensely from the company's collapse after the indictment was announced. One of the most shocking moments came when Wahlberg revealed a sealed agreement between Kerr and a private hedge fund that had bankrolled media stories trashing Wahlberg's reputation. The agreement included provisions for post-trial consulting fees and bonus clauses based on successful destabilization of IronCore Dynamics market value. Wahlberg used this document to argue that Kerr had not only sabotaged the company from within but had constructed a house of cards designed to collapse onto one man's back. The prosecution objected, but Judge Morgan overruled, stating that Wahlberg had provided sufficient foundation for relevance. Every eye in the courtroom was now on Wahlberg, not as an actor or a celebrity but as a man revealing a truth too vast to ignore. He walked the jury through the timeline like a historian laying out evidence of a coup, showing how each event, the resignations, the leaks, the valuation discrepancies, could be traced to Kerr's manipulations. More than once, jurors nodded visibly, some even glancing at Kerr with narrowed eyes. The prosecutor attempted to salvage her narrative, calling forensic accountants to reaffirm the irregularities in IronCore's books, but Wahlberg systematically dismantled their testimony by exposing biases, flawed methodology, and even previous disciplinary action against one of the experts for manipulating data in another case. He didn't just defend himself. He gutted the opposition's case to its foundation, leaving behind only a shell of accusations. Wahlberg's closing cross-examination of one of the government's final witnesses, a junior analyst who had worked under Kerr, was perhaps his most devastating. He treated the analyst with care, acknowledging the pressure she had been under, then gently guided her through a series of questions that revealed she had been instructed by Kerr to omit key variables in her risk assessments. She broke down on the stand, tearfully admitting that she had questioned the numbers but had been told to just follow orders. Wahlberg walked back to his desk in complete silence, letting the weight of her words linger like a storm cloud hanging over the prosecution's bench. At the end of the day, Judge Morgan recessed court and sat in stunned silence for a few extra seconds before rising. He didn't say anything to Wahlberg directly, but he didn't have to. The entire courtroom felt the change. Outside, reporters swarmed like hornets, shouting questions about sabotage, about Kerr, about whether Wahlberg was about to win. But the man at the center of it all said nothing. He moved through the chaos like a ghost, his mind already focused on the final phase. Inside his home, he continued refining his closing arguments, his war room covered with sticky notes, timelines, exhibits, and legal briefs. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night, sustained by sheer willpower and an obsessive clarity of purpose. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was revealing a conspiracy, exposing an entire machine designed to consume reputations and convert public trust into capital. He had become a symbol, albeit reluctantly, of what it meant to be underestimated. As the week drew to a close, Wahlberg filed a final motion requesting judicial notice of the hedge fund's financial relationships with multiple media outlets, arguing that public perception had been unduly influenced by orchestrated campaigns. Though Judge Morgan denied the motion, He did so with uncharacteristic respect, acknowledging that Wahlberg's arguments had elevated the complexity and depth of the proceedings to an extraordinary degree. That acknowledgement, understated though it was, marked a tectonic shift in their relationship. Wahlberg, once the object of derision, had forced the court to reckon with the idea that genius doesn't always wear robes or carry degrees. Sometimes, it wears silence like armor and patience like a blade. And now, the trial was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about truth, manipulation, and the cost of believing appearances over evidence. The tide had turned completely, and everyone knew it. By the time court resumed the following Monday, Judge Harold Morgan entered the courtroom with a subtle but undeniable shift in demeanor. Not exactly contrition, but something close to caution, as if the weight of the last 3 weeks had cracked the rigid mask of superiority he wore so comfortably when this all began. The courtroom itself no longer held the same chaotic buzz it once did. It had matured into something reverent, tense, charged with the awareness that something far beyond legal proceedings was unfolding. Mark Wahlberg stood at his place at the defense table, no longer perceived as a celebrity slumming it through litigation, but as the unpredictable and disciplined force who had somehow turned a courtroom into his domain. Even the prosecutors approached their bench with a restraint that hadn't been present in the earlier days, their confidence now tempered by the public unraveling of their case and the sheer speed at which Wahlberg had shifted the narrative. With each court session, the press outside grew louder, yet more respectful, trading out their snarky headlines for serious legal commentary and op-eds questioning systemic bias against defendants who defy expectation. Inside the room, Judge Morgan now paused before responding to Wahlberg's legal arguments, granting him the full latitude afforded any licensed attorney, and when Wahlberg requested additional time to organize his visual exhibits for closing arguments, the judge simply nodded and ordered a brief recess without his usual grumbling sarcasm. This was not the man who had once joked about SAG cards and community theater. This was a judge now wrestling with the reality that he may have drastically underestimated someone in full view of the public eye. The subtle change reached its apex during a late afternoon exchange when Wahlberg motioned to introduce a short video deposition from a European investor whose testimony directly refuted the prosecution's timeline of financial misrepresentation. The prosecution objected, claiming the video had not been properly disclosed, but Wahlberg calmly presented the delivery receipt and email correspondence showing it had, in fact, been submitted ahead of schedule. Judge Morgan glanced over the documentation, adjusted his glasses, and for a moment simply stared at the screen in front of him before finally speaking. The court recognizes the error was not with the defense. Motion granted. It wasn't just the ruling that mattered, it was the tone. There was no contempt, no smirk, just a voice that had been forced to acknowledge that the man before him was not only competent but, in many ways, exceptional. After the video played and the investors clear, unwavering words contradicted key claims made by the government's expert. Wahlberg thanked the court with quiet professionalism and returned to his seat. Judge Morgan watched him walk back with an expression not of annoyance, but of reluctant admiration. That admiration began to spread. Court officers, clerks, and even visiting law students who had begun attending the trial for academic credit now whispered about Wahlberg's performance, the way young athletes discuss legendary underdog comebacks. The jury had visibly transformed as well. No longer skeptical, now fully engaged, some leaning forward in their seats each time he stood to speak, notebooks filled with more notes during his arguments than during the prosecution's. The prosecution, for their part, did their best to mount a salvage operation, attempting to refocus the court's attention on the original violations, SEC filings, investor calls, misstatements of financial projections. But the weight of Kerr's exposed deception and Wahlberg's devastating rebuttals had already broken the spine of their argument. During one particularly bold maneuver, Wahlberg submitted a timeline visual, charting every moment of the company's financial trajectory against key public statements and investment actions taken by Kerr's shell accounts, correlating them with external market events and press leaks. It wasn't just compelling, it was bulletproof. The judge allowed the visual, and the jury watched silently as Wahlberg narrated each point, building tension like a maestro leading a symphony of evidence. Then came the moment that no one could have predicted, not even Wahlberg himself. Near the end of the presentation, Judge Morgan leaned forward, interlaced his fingers, and said, "Mr. Wahlberg, would you be willing to explain the methodology behind this correlation analysis?" There was no sarcasm, no performative disbelief, just a direct question from a judge who had once mocked him in front of a laughing room and now sought his insight. Wahlberg nodded and spent 5 minutes breaking down the mathematical modeling he had used, citing 2 financial fraud studies from Harvard Business School and 1 from Oxford that supported the pattern recognition techniques in his timeline. Morgan didn't interrupt. When he finished, the judge simply said, "Understood. Thank you." That brief exchange shattered the last illusion that this trial was still celebrity theater. What remained was a courtroom led, in many ways, by a man who had never stepped foot in law school, but who now stood on equal footing with the very institutions that once ridiculed him. Outside the courthouse, news anchors recapped the day's events with a growing sense of awe. Legal scholars took to podcasts and live streams to discuss the rarity of such a transformation, and one even called it the legal version of watching Jordan drop 63 at the Garden. Meanwhile, social media exploded with side-by-side clips of Judge Morgan's earlier insults and his newer, respectful tone. One video went viral, showing the stark contrast. "Let's simplify things for our movie star," followed by, "Would you be willing to explain your methodology, Mr. Wahlberg?" Thousands of comments pointed out how quickly the balance of power had shifted, and how graciously Wahlberg had carried the burden of doubt until it simply disintegrated under the weight of his competence. Inside chambers, it was rumored that Judge Morgan had called an unscheduled private meeting with both legal teams, offering additional time for final statements. An unprecedented move in his courtroom, signaling how seriously he was now taking the proceedings. The day of closing arguments, the gallery was filled to capacity. Federal agents lined the back wall, and cameras outside broadcasted commentary from legal analysts watching every move. When Wahlberg rose to deliver his statement, the room went still. He spoke not with passion, but with precision, laying out the anatomy of the deception against him and the structural failings that had allowed the narrative to go unchecked. He reminded the court that while he may be known as an actor, his life had been built on discipline, study, and work ethic, and that the man painted in the indictment bore little resemblance to the one who had built IronCore from the ground up. He asked not for pity, but for clarity. He cited case law, federal statutes, and the very principles the court claimed to uphold. When he sat down, even the prosecution delayed their response, clearly shaken by the gravity of his statement. Judge Morgan adjourned court with a single phrase that echoed across every major news network within the hour. "The court recognizes the defense has exceeded expectations, both legal and professional." It was not an apology, but it was more than validation. It was a reversal of judgment. The same man who once mocked Wahlberg at every turn now found himself forced to acknowledge, on the record, that he had been wrong. Wahlberg didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, gathered his files, and walked out with the same unassuming grace he had entered with. The court wasn't just changed, it was humbled. And in that silence, in the space between ridicule and recognition, Mark Wahlberg had done something almost impossible. He had made justice look like redemption. When the jury returned with a verdict after just 6 hours of deliberation, the courtroom was silent, save for the low hum of camera shutters from the press pool section and the nervous shifting of seats from both sides of the gallery. Mark Wahlberg sat at the defense table in the same calm posture he had maintained throughout the trial, hands clasped lightly, eyes fixed forward, his expression unreadable but composed, as if he already knew what was coming. Judge Harold Morgan entered from chambers not with the theatrical flair he'd once favored, but with a measured pace and a face that held none of the sardonic energy that had defined the trial's early days. There was no fanfare, no final jab, no drawn-out performance. Just a quiet clearing of the throat and a nod to the bailiff, who stepped forward to take the verdict envelope from the jury foreperson. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Wahlberg, not guilty on all counts," she said, her voice unwavering. There was no explosion of applause. Morgan had warned against any outbursts, but a collective exhale rippled through the room like a balloon finally allowed to deflate. Wahlberg gave a single, brief nod, his face still unreadable, while his former attorneys, now seated in the gallery like everyone else, looked on with something that resembled stunned pride. Judge Morgan glanced at Wahlberg for a moment longer than necessary, the weight of everything unspoken pressing into the space between them. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned into the microphone and addressed the courtroom. Mr. Wahlberg has demonstrated not only a mastery of legal process, but an unwavering respect for the decorum and dignity of this court. He began, his voice void of mockery, heavy instead with sincerity and, perhaps, remorse. It would be dishonest of me not to acknowledge that I grossly misjudged him at the outset of these proceedings. What began as skepticism on my part grew into admiration. Rarely have I witnessed such poise, preparation, and discipline from any party, let alone a pro-se defendant. For what it's worth, I was wrong. The gallery held its breath, and even the clerks turned toward the bench, surprised by the unexpected humility in the judge's tone. Wahlberg didn't bask in the moment. He stood slowly, bowed his head in acknowledgement, and responded only with, "Thank you, Your Honor." And that was it. The trial was over, the charges were dismissed, and the case that had begun as a presumed farce had ended in absolute vindication. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Supporters, doubters, journalists, and even those who had never cared about the specifics of the trial but had followed every twist like a serialized drama. As Wahlberg exited the building flanked by a small circle of security and legal consultants, the first question shouted wasn't about the verdict, but about what he planned to do next. He didn't answer right away. He stopped for a moment, looked at the swarm of microphones, and said, "This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving something to myself. And I hope it shows that no one should be judged by headlines or assumptions." Then he stepped into the waiting vehicle and was gone, the door closing with finality behind him. The moment was immortalized instantly. Photos of Wahlberg leaving the courthouse head held high splashed across every major network and news outlet, while the online world erupted with tributes, fan edits, legal commentary, and a new wave of memes that painted him not as a subject of ridicule, but as a symbol of perseverance. More than one law professor admitted in interviews that they would now be teaching elements of the trial in their upcoming semesters, not just for the case study, but for the way it had challenged bias and transformed public perception. Over the following weeks, Wahlberg remained mostly silent, declining interviews and avoiding the talk show circuit entirely, instead retreating into a rare period of privacy that only seemed to add to the myth that had formed around the trial. His publicist confirmed that he was back to spending time with family, engaging in early morning workouts, and volunteering quietly with criminal justice organizations focused on wrongful convictions and public defense reform. But the story didn't end with the verdict. It evolved. Universities reached out, offering honorary law degrees, which he declined. Legal societies requested him as a speaker. One prominent Boston law school even proposed naming an annual lecture after him. He declined that, too. Instead, Wahlberg channeled his energy into something quieter, more lasting. Within 2 months of the verdict, he announced the formation of the Kerr-Wahlberg Legal Initiative, not as a jab at the man who tried to sabotage him, but as a declaration of purpose. The organization would offer free legal literacy workshops for at-risk youth, scholarship opportunities for first-generation law students, and resources for individuals choosing to represent themselves in civil court. The initiative was met with skepticism at first, some critics assuming it was a PR move to capitalize on his legal fame. But then the stories began emerging. Young men and women in underfunded communities attending seminars taught by top-tier lawyers Wahlberg had personally recruited, workshops hosted in community centers, correctional facilities, and even on military bases for veterans facing complex benefits appeals. His hands-on involvement was undeniable. He wasn't just funding the initiative, he was showing up, sitting in back rows, asking questions, listening. At one event in New Jersey, he spent 4 hours sitting with a group of teenagers walking through the basics of Fourth Amendment rights and how to handle interactions with law enforcement. One student was quoted in a local paper saying, "I came here because I liked his movies. I left because I saw what it means to never quit." The legal community had no choice but to reckon with his influence. Bar associations, once skeptical, now debated the merit of creating parallel paths for self-educated legal advocates. One federal judge anonymously told a reporter, "The man made us all look twice at our assumptions. That's the power of humility, discipline, and undeniable preparation." Meanwhile, Judge Harold Morgan faced his own reckoning. In a rare interview given to a legal ethics panel, he admitted that his treatment of Wahlberg during the opening days of the trial had been unprofessional and rooted in implicit bias. "I believed he was playing a part. Turns out, he was revealing one," Morgan said. The quote became the opening line of a documentary in production titled Beyond the Verdict, already optioned by several major streaming platforms. Wahlberg declined to participate. He had no interest in turning his trial into entertainment. That part of his life, he insisted, was behind him. But the cultural ripple effects were undeniable. Law schools saw a spike in applications referencing Wahlberg's trial in personal statements. A best-selling nonfiction book emerged, The Actor Who Defended Himself, written by a journalist who had covered every day of the case. Even late-night comedians, once gleeful in mocking his predicament, now referenced the trial with awe, often joking, "You know who should have been my lawyer? Mark freaking Wahlberg." Yet through it all, Wahlberg remained centered, rarely speaking about the experience directly except to say, "When they told me I couldn't, I decided I would. Not to win, to understand." That quote, understated and quiet, was engraved on the welcome wall of the Wahlberg Legal Initiative headquarters when it opened its first permanent office in downtown Boston. What had begun as a public crucifixion disguised as a trial had become one of the most profound acts of transformation the modern legal system had ever witnessed. Wahlberg hadn't just cleared his name, he had redefined it. In doing so, he reminded the world that redemption isn't always loud, justice isn't always obvious, and sometimes the ones we laugh at the hardest are the ones who end up teaching us the most. In the silence after the verdict, after the applause had faded and the cameras turned away, what remained was a legacy forged not in fame or fortune, but in resolve, in intellect, and in the quiet genius of a man who refused to be reduced to anyone's expectations.